times of the year. For in Europe, as we have seen, it appears that one man was commonly slain in the character of the tree spirit in spring, and another in the character of the corn spirit in autumn. It may have been so in Phrygia also. Attis was especially a tree god, and his connexion with corn may have been only such an extension of the power of a tree spirit as is indicated in customs like the Harvest May. Again, the representative of Attis appears to have been slain in spring, whereas Lityerses must have been slain in summer or autumn, according to the time of the harvest in Phrygia. On the whole, then, while we are not justified in regarding Lityerses as the prototype of Attis, the two may be regarded as parallel products of the same religious idea, and may have stood to each other as in Europe the Old Man of harvest stands to the Wild Man, the Leaf Man, and so forth, of spring. Both were spirits or deities of vegetation, and the personal representatives of both were annually slain. But whereas the Attis worship became elevated into the dignity of a state religion and spread to Italy, the rites of Lityerses seem never to have passed the limits of their native Phrygia, and always retained their character of rustic ceremonies performed by peasants on the harvest field. At most a few villages may have clubbed together, as amongst the Khonds, to procure a human victim to be slain as representative of the corn spirit for their common benefit. Such victims may have been drawn from the families of priestly kings or kinglets, which would account for the legendary character of Lityerses as the son of a Phrygian king or as himself a king. When villages did not so club together, each village or farm may have procured its own representative of the corn spirit by dooming to death either a passing stranger or the harvester who cut, bound, or threshed the last sheaf. Perhaps in the olden time the practice of head hunting as a means of promoting the growth of the corn may have been as common among the rude inhabitants of Europe and Western Asia as it still is, or was till lately, among the primitive agricultural tribes of Assam, Burma, the Philippine Islands, and the Indian Archipelago. It is hardly necessary to add that in Phrygia, as in Europe, the old barbarous custom of killing a man on the harvest field or the threshing floor had doubtless passed into a mere pretence long before the classical era, and was probably regarded by the reapers and threshers themselves as no more than a rough jest which the licence of a harvest home permitted them to play off on a passing stranger, a comrade, or even on their master himself. I have dwelt on the Lityerses song at length, because it affords so many points of comparison with European and savage folk custom. The other harvest songs of Western Asia and Egypt, to which attention has been called above, may now be dismissed much more briefly. The similarity of the Bithynian Bormus to the Phrygian Lityerses helps to bear out the interpretation which has been given of the latter. Bormus, whose death, or rather disappearance, was annually mourned by the reapers in a plaintive song, was, like Lityerses, a king's son, or at least the son of a wealthy and distinguished man. The reapers whom he watched were at work on his own fields, and he disappeared in going to fetch water for them. According to one version of the story, he was carried off by the nymphs, doubtless the nymphs of the spring or pool or river whither he went to draw water. Viewed in the light of the Lityerses story and of European folk custom, this disappearance of Bormus may be a reminiscence of the custom of binding the farmer himself in a corn sheaf and throwing him into the water. The mournful strain which the reapers sang was probably a lamentation over the death of the corn spirit, slain either in the cut corn or in the person of a human representative, and the call which they addressed to him may have been a prayer that he might return in fresh vigour next year. The Phoenician Linus song was sung at the vintage, at least in the west of Asia Minor, as we learn from Homer, and this combined with the legend of Syleus suggests that in ancient times passing strangers were handled by vintagers and vine diggers in much the same way as they are said to have been handled by the reaper Lityerses. The Lydian Silaus, so ran the legend, compelled passers by to dig for him in his vineyard, till Hercules came and killed him and dug up his vines by the roots. This seems to be the outline of a legend like that of Lityerses, but neither ancient writers nor modern folk custom enable us to fill in the details. But further, the Linus song was probably sung also by Phoenician reapers, for Herodotus compares it to the Maneros song, which, as we have seen, was a lament raised by Egyptian reapers over the cut corn. Further, Linus was identified with Adonis, and Adonis has some claims to be regarded as especially a corn deity. Thus the Linus lament, as sung at harvest, would be identical with the Adonis lament; each would be the lamentation raised by reapers over the dead spirit of the corn. But whereas Adonis, like Attis, grew into a stately figure of mythology, adored and mourned in splendid cities far beyond the limits of his Phoenician home, Linus appears to have remained a simple ditty sung by reapers and vintagers among the corn sheaves and the vines. The analogy of Lityerses and of folk custom, both European and savage, suggests that in Phoenicia the slain corn spirit, the dead Adonis, may formerly have been represented by a human victim, and this suggestion is possibly supported by the Harran legend that Tammuz (Adonis) was slain by his cruel lord, who ground his bones in a mill and scattered them to the wind. For in Mexico, as we have seen, the human victim at harvest was crushed between two stones, and both in Africa and India the ashes or other remains of the victim were scattered over the fields. But the Harran legend may be only a mythical way of expressing the grinding of corn in the mill and the scattering of the seed. It seems worth suggesting that the mock king who was annually killed at the Babylonian festival of the Sacaea on the 16th day of the month Lus may have represented Tammuz himself. For the historian Berosus, who records the festival and its date, probably used the Macedonian calendar, since he dedicated his history to Antiochus Soter, and in his day the Macedonian month Lus appears to have corresponded to the Babylonian month Tammuz. If this conjecture is right, the view that the mock king at Sacaea was slain in the character of a god would be established. There is a good deal more evidence that in Egypt the slain corn spirit, the dead Osiris, was represented by a human victim, whom the reapers slew on the harvest field, mourning his death in a dirge, to which the Greeks, through a verbal misunderstanding, gave the name of Maneros. For the legend of Busiris seems to preserve a reminiscence of human sacrifices once offered by the Egyptians in connexion with the worship of Osiris. Busiris was said to have been an Egyptian king who sacrificed all strangers on the altar of Zeus. The origin of the custom was traced to a dearth which afflicted the land of Egypt for 9 years. A Cyprian seer informed Busiris that the dearth would cease if a man were annually sacrificed to Zeus. So Busiris instituted the sacrifice. But when Hercules came to Egypt and was being dragged to the altar to be sacrificed, he burst his bonds and slew Busiris and his son. Here then is a legend that in Egypt a human victim was annually sacrificed to prevent the failure of the crops, and a belief is implied that an omission of the sacrifice would have entailed a recurrence of that infertility which it was the object of the sacrifice to prevent. So the Pawnees, as we have seen, believed that an omission of the human sacrifice at planting would have been followed by a total failure of their crops. The name Busiris was in reality the name of a city, Per Assar, the house of Osiris, the city being so called because it contained the grave of Osiris. Indeed, some high modern authorities believe that Busiris was the original home of Osiris, from which his worship spread to other parts of Egypt. The human sacrifices were said to have been offered at his grave, and the victims were red haired men, whose ashes were